This is a great crowd. I wanted to just do something briefly before we get started, which is to take a short little straw poll. How many people here heard about this from a Truth Out mailing? All right, good. How many people here heard about it from the Facebook invite event? Excellent. Then how many people here heard about it on Rick Wolff's website or his newsletter? And how many people here heard about it on WBAI? Awesome. Excellent. Well, then I'll start by thanking our media sponsor, WBAI, for making sure we got a lot of people here today. It's lovely to see you all. I think that this is one of those unique events where we get to talk about something that's incredibly important, and I guess you're all WBAI listeners, so you listen to it all day. But we're at a time in the world where the discussion of politics and the discussion of economics has become very real in a lot of our lives. And I don't know about you all, but it feels like a little bit of a unbalanced moment, or it feels like you can almost feel a tipping point, and it's just very tangible these days. Just a little bit about me. My name is Matt Renner. I'm the Director of Communications and Development at truthout.org. For those of you who aren't familiar, Truth Out is an online, progressive, and very independent news website. We work to bring a little bit of clarity and some new ideas and perspectives to the internet, and to we've been able to catapult some big stories into the mainstream press, which has been one of our proudest accomplishments. I'm not sure if you all have heard about it, because often CNN or 60 Minutes will take our name off of it and steal our reporting, but they do. It's lovely. They can't pay for that part of the news anymore. But the other reason I'm here with a group called US Uncut, and I'm not sure, and I'm one of the organizers, and mostly just an activist and a guy who pretends to be a banker on the weekends, and thank everyone for making me not have to pay any taxes. But US Uncut is a new organization that there'll be a clipboard coming around from my friend Bernadette here, who, if you all sign up, you'll get our action alerts. The idea is to make corporations who avoid paying taxes and thus force politicians to cut budgets and cut services on poor people and working people, we want to make them a little more uncomfortable. Right now they do that with almost complete impunity. And the front page of the New York Times ran a story about GE paying no taxes. I wanted to read a couple more numbers. I'm not going to bore you with too many of these, and feel free to boo if you hear a name that you don't like or a statistic you don't like. Let's start with my favorite. Bank of America received a $1.9 billion tax refund from the IRS last year. This despite making $4.4 billion in profits. And that's on top of the $1 trillion bailout that they received. Another one is General Electric, which you all might have heard about. Made $26 billion in profits in the United States and received a $4.1 billion refund from the government. And another one you all might have heard of called Goldman Sachs. In 2001 was taxed at a rate of 1.1% of its income, even though it earned a profit of $2.3 billion and received $800 billion from the Federal Reserve and U.S. Treasury Department, or guarantees up to $800 billion. So that's to set the stage here, because what we're facing now is, and it's actually really heartening to see, is a global resurgence. The title of tonight's talk is Opposition to Paying for Capitalism's Crisis, a Global Movement. And those of us, and I'm sure the sentiment is shared in this room, who see this plainly as a crisis of capitalism, and one that we did not create, but we're being asked to pay for, it's ludicrous, and it's absolutely unacceptable, and I, for one, refuse to be a part of paying for that. Thank you. I I want to introduce Rick Wolff. Professor Richard Wolff was a professor of economics, or is a professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, where he taught for 35 years from 1973 to 2008. Recently, he's become a regular contributor to both Truth Out and The Guardian, where his work has been getting an incredible amount of attention. I mean, you should see the comments on these things. It's as if the entire U.S. media had been lying to us about economics for the last 50 or 60 years. Shocking, I know, but this information is vital, and Rick has become a friend, and his information is so valuable, and I just want to thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope that after this, you'll consider getting involved with US Uncut and getting out there and getting active to be actually in the street in the way of being rolled over by the crimes of capitalism and the politicians that they've paid for to make sure that it comes out of our paycheck instead of theirs. Thank you. A couple things. There'll be a question and answer period at the end where we'll have mics and we'll walk around so you can just raise your hand. Also at the end, there'll be refreshments over on the table. And to get involved, you can sign up with the US Uncut. The sign-up sheet is going around. And also you can check out Rick Wolff's website, which is rdwolff.com, right? rdwolff.com. And sign up for the newsletter there and at Truth Out. And here's Rick Wolff.
Thank you all for coming along and showing that you care enough to think about becoming part of a change. This program that I've just started last week on WBAI begins with music from one of the great musicians of the 20th century, John Lee Hooker, and the song ends up with the line, "Change is gonna come." And I picked that because it does really seem, after so many times when I hoped for it, but didn't quite get it, or hoped for it and saw it and then saw it fade out, and I know that we don't know yet where the current moment is going to go, but it was heartening to see 70,000 people in Wisconsin say something, and even though it's a smaller number in Ohio that's doing it now, same issue, by the way. The government in Ohio is about to take away the bargaining rights of public employees in Ohio, just as they voted to do in Wisconsin, and other states are underway. The response and the fight back is really extraordinary. It's taken longer here. And while I'm going to, in a minute, go through the crisis and where we are in it, I do want to talk a little bit for a moment about the reaction in other parts of the world, at least so that everyone's clear what can be done. I'm going to pick just a few European countries because they are ahead of us in this sort of thing. Greece, 6 general strikes in 2010, 1 so far this year. It's still early. They shut the place down, and they are making major headway in putting together an opposition to the imposition of austerity there, which is very severe. I went to Athens last spring and happened to be there when the public employees got their first wage cut. 20% less one day in the weekly check that would be then maintained in one act, 20%. The professors, because it's a public education system there, they're all public employees, and they all came to me at the end of my talk and said, you know, look at this. How am I supposed to pay my children's education? How am I supposed to do all the rest? In France, in the summer of last year, the French, who do these things with a flair, literally shut the country down. It was extraordinary. You could not get in and out of Paris. You could not make a phone call. The telephone workers stopped the process. The working class in France basically said, nothing's going to happen. Simultaneous demonstrations in 270 cities across France, the same hour of the same day, just to let everyone know. 2.5 million people. That's in a country much smaller than ours. Give you some idea of what happened. 4 general strikes last year in Italy. For some reason, the American newspapers do not report most of this sort of thing, but I'm just telling you what any European newspaper would have reported on. And lest you think this was all last year, let me give you a couple of other examples. 10 days ago, 2.5% of the population of Portugal went out on the street. That would mean in the United States, 2.5%, something like 7, 8 million people. We've never had 7, 8 million people come out for anything in the United States. That would be an unheard of historical break. And 4 days later, the government of Portugal collapsed, which, in case you haven't paid attention, because it's not front page news exactly, there is no government in Portugal right now. And the interesting thing, to underscore what Matt said, the interesting thing about Portugal is that all the other political parties broke with tradition. The left-wing parties, oh, I should mention, Portugal has left-wing parties. Portugal has a communist party, for example, regularly gets between 10 and 20% of the vote. Very strong. It has a variety of left parties, and it has a variety of right-wing and conservative parties. The government was pushing through the 3rd stage of an austerity program, cutbacks in services, cutbacks in employees. But something happened. And when they put forward this next phase of it, all the other political parties, not just the left-wing ones, but the right-wing ones, said, no, can't do it. And the press went to them and said, you voted for it before. What happened? Well, they said, we want to do it. We understand the reasons. But our constituents have told us that if we vote for another step of austerity, they'll never vote for us again. And we are politicians, and much as we would like to keep going and doing what we can't anymore because we're finished if we do it. So the government collapsed. And no one knows what's going to happen in Portugal. But that is a sign of something much bigger and much more profound. That hasn't happened yet in other European countries. It's an extraordinarily important step because it's a unified across the political spectrum that this making people pay for the economic crisis by suffering cuts in services, suffering more unemployment, that won't wash. So let's turn to the United States, which is where we are and where we live, and go through a little bit of this process too. And again, I want to start at the end, sort of like telling the punchline and then going and building the joke up again. We are in a society that has about 10% unemployment now. The unemployment, just so you know, is when we give that number, 9, 10% that you hear on the radio, that only refers to the people who are adults looking for work and unable to find it. The Bureau of Labor Statistics in Washington actually keeps these statistics every week and every month, has a number they prefer, and which is a much better number to understand unemployment, and that adds together 3 groups. The people who are adults looking for work and unable to find it, but it adds 2 other groups. People who are part-time but want a full-time job. They're unable to get a full-time job, but they want it, because these people are figuratively, partly at least, unemployed relative to what they're capable of and what they want. And the 3rd group you might like really better, they have a wonderful name by the statisticians, marginal workers. Who are they? They're the ones who have looked for so long that they've given up looking. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics counts these. If you put them all together, the unemployment rate in the United States right now is 16.25%. 1 out of 6 Americans in the workforce is in one of those 3 groups. That means every family in America has somebody, cousin, uncle, sister, niece, in that box. And if you're suffering that kind of income loss, then you become, sooner or later, whether you mean it or not, a bit of a burden on the others, making it harder for everybody because you turn to your friends and neighbors and your relatives to help you. So the unemployment here is terrible. Terrible. And hasn't gotten appreciably better for 2 years. There's no recovery in the realm of employment that matters. Nothing remotely like a return to what we had. Let me turn to the second sector, just to drive the point home. Second sector is housing. I don't know if you noticed the front page of the New York Times, I believe it was today or yesterday, going through the kind of sad story of how the modest plan to help people being thrown out of their homes hasn't in fact even been done in the United States. They have nice little circles to show you how big the plans were, how little was finally done, and how few people were finally helped. But the reality is there will be more foreclosures this year than at any time in this crisis. It hasn't gotten better, it's getting worse. 1.5 million are scheduled to be thrown out of their homes. It's an interesting country that in the middle of a crisis, with large amounts of housing vacant because there's nobody in it, we're now going to take more people and throw them out of the houses so they can sit on the grass across the street and look at the house they no longer can live in. It's an amazing move, but it's very serious. Last thing about housing. If you look at what we call the housing market, that's basically a measure of the number of houses on the market to be sold, the prices they're getting, the inventory building up of unsold houses. Then the thing that you may have heard of, the double dip, that's the idea that we're in a crisis, we get out of it, but then, uh-oh, we dip again, a double dip back down. That's already in the housing market. The last 4 months, the housing market turned back down. So when you hear about recovery, the housing market is not being discussed, nor is the unemployment much. Now, housing is one of the most important sectors in this country. It involves construction, it involves the building, the manufacture of furniture, of all the accoutrements of a house. It's a major part of our economy. For that to be going down, and going down fast over the last 3 or 4 months, makes the use of the term recovery stop being a question of poor judgment and veer over into what we used to call lying. We're not in an economy that is in any kind of good shape. And that all is true before we look at the two big factors that are now threatening the American economy, which is rising energy prices and rising food prices. Rising energy prices is a very serious problem. Everything you're wearing, everything you bought for lunch today, came to wherever you bought it from by a truck. The truck runs on petrol, on petroleum products. That is going to affect the price of everything. Our inflation the last month or two have been jumps in the rate of growth of the price of everything in the United States because everything depends on energy. What does that mean? It means all of us, whether we pay for heating oil in our home or gasoline to power our cars and so on, we're all going to have to spend more money on those things, which is less money we're going to be able to spend on everything else. And where does that money go? Into the hands of a dozen national oil companies somewhere in the world and the companies that process all that stuff. And so the money is being taken from the mass of people who, if they spent it, could actually get the economy going, and being funneled into the hands of those who are already richer than Croesus and are not going to spend that money because they never do anyway. That's not a good way of managing an economic crisis. That's a disaster. And since one of the major ways we have food in the United States is by fertilizer, and since a major ingredient of fertilizer is petroleum, the process of rising food prices is now scheduled to be a plague on us for at least the rest of this year. So if you want to stock up on canned peas, it's probably a financially wise move to do soon. So we're not out of our economic crisis, not by a long shot. And we are plagued by a number of issues in our economy that could take a fragile economy already and plunge it into a disaster zone. Now, some of you think, I suppose, that President Obama and the Democratic Party won't let that happen because it will be so dangerous to their election possibilities if we have a terrible economy going into the next year, which it certainly will be. But as a professional economist all my life, let me assure you that because the people who pay economists want something doesn't mean that the economists can produce it. President Bush had the best economists around, just like Obama does, and the worst conceivable thing that could have happened to Mr. Bush in the last year of his presidency was to be the president in a collapse. The economists couldn't save him from that. And part of the election that blew Mr. Obama into office was a win that was so angry about what was left over from the Bush time that was fueled by that economic crisis and the fear that it struck in everyone's heart. What got Mr. Obama in was the same anger about the crisis that made him suffer an election reverse last year, which can do the same to the Republicans next year. Because there's a fuel of anger, the very thing that Matt said at the beginning is now tipping the politics of America. That anger is going after whoever looks to be in charge with the fury about a problem that doesn't go away and threatens our future. And I'm going to come back at the end to talk about that. Let me try briefly, and my apologies to those of you that may have heard this before, to give you a very quick overview of what this crisis is and why it happened. This is not the typical up and down of the American economy. Our system, capitalism, is fundamentally unstable. I'll give you an idea. The last big collapse like this one was in the 1930s. That's the really big one, the one that everybody looks to who studies these things. And that was a real doozy. However, since that was over, when that ended, and it took 11 years, 1929, 1940, when that was over, you might have thought, okay, well, we've put that behind us. But between the end of the Great Depression and the beginning of the one we're in now, 2007, there were 11 others, 11 downturns. Those of you who were around New York in the 1970s may remember there was a big one here then. New York City kept headlines, bankruptcy, and so forth. So this is a system that throws us out of work and plunges us into economic trouble every few years. And no president and no political party and no economic argument has yet figured out how to stop that. Every president, including this one, has gone on radio before we had television, or television since then, and said something about his policies. Usually he said this: I've got these policies in place to get us out of this crisis. And then there was a pregnant pause, and then he continued, and to make sure we do not have these again in the future. By that standard, every president of the United States has been a liar, hasn't been able to deliver on that promise. And given that President Obama is doing things that others have done, and nothing really new, there's not much reason to believe that his promise that it won't happen again is worth believing. We're stuck with this. But this one is very bad because it comes at the end of a 30-year period in American history, which some economists, some of us, have been talking about for a while, but really kind of no one wanted to listen. But now, just as people are beginning to listen about the concerns about nuclear power, given what's happened in Japan, we have an economic crisis that makes folks willing to think again about the last 30 years. Very briefly, first, over the last 30 years, a fundamental change happened in the United States that cannot be overstated or exaggerated. Real wages, what actually you get per hour of work you do, if you're an average American worker, stopped rising. For 150 years before the 1970s, it had kept going up. It's an amazing story. It's what made the United States an unusual place to be. It was part of the reason why so many people came from all over the place to come here, because they had gotten the idea here, things got better, and they were right. And there was no great mystery about it. Businesses had to pay higher wages, and they had to pay higher wages because there was a labor shortage here. We weren't very nice to the people we found here, those of us who came here. We killed them. That meant they weren't there, and they wouldn't have worked for us anyway. We brought some people here against their will. We all know who those folks are. But a lot of people came here for looking for higher wages, which meant you had to give them higher wages because they wouldn't have come here otherwise, and then you would have had no one to work for you. But the problem here in America was not just bringing them here. You had to keep them in the job once they came here, because it turns out, having taken the land away from the Native Americans, it was free land for everybody. And if you didn't treat your worker real nicely here on the East Coast, where they tended to come, they would run away and start farming, which is what most of them knew how to do anyway. So to get the worker to come, you had to keep wages rising. And to keep a worker, you had to keep wages rising. So for 150 years, Americans got this weird idea that they lived in a charmed place, God really loved us here, and the wages cold. We could have a higher standard of living. We could work hard and get better paid. In the rest of the world, people understand you have to work hard. The rest doesn't seem to follow, at least not the way it did here. So Americans got this idea that it's going to get better. Every generation is going to live better. My kids are going to have opportunities I didn't have, and my grandkids still better ones. Try with me, just to imagine for a minute, what would happen to a culture and a population which for 150 years believes what I just said, because it's more or less true, and then it all stops. Just stops. And that's the truth. The real wage in the United States, average amount you earn, adjusted for the prices of the things you have to buy, is exactly the same now as it was in 1978. No change. Actually, a little less, but basically the same. Americans were shocked, awed, you might say, traumatized if you're into psychology. But because we are a people who are very individualistic, we reacted as a nation to this sea change. By the way, a fundamental change that nobody talked about. No president went on TV to talk to us. What does it mean? How do we deal with this? How do we get around this, overcome it? Nothing. So Americans dealt with it as individuals. That meant we tried as a nation to solve a social change with an individual act. Never a good move. Got a social problem? You need a social solution. What the individual act ends up being is an attempt to escape. Doesn't work real well. Here's how the American people escaped. And elsewhere I go through all the details, but we don't have the time here. Americans escaped in two ways. First, they did more work. If the wage per hour doesn't go up, but you want to give the American dream to your children, an education, a nice home, a nice car, a vacation, all the rest, and you can't get it by rising wages the way your parents and grandparents might have, well, then you do more hours. You get more people in the house to do more hours of work. And starting in the 1970s, that's what we did. Americans did more and more hours. If you had a job, you got a second job. If you were a teenager, you did something on the weekends and maybe after school. And if you were retired, you rethought your retirement. But the biggest change was the adult American woman who began leaving the house where they had spent a large amount of their time and went into paid employment. Now, some people in America have been doing that a long time, but I'm talking about a huge sea change in which millions and millions of American women moved into the labor force in a massive way. If I had time, I'd talk to you about all the changes that meant in our culture. You've all lived through them. Women hold the family life together, the emotional center of most American households. You make women exhausted by working them an extra shift. Famous professor of sociology in Berkeley, wonderful woman named Arlie Hochschild, wrote a book called The Second Shift, where she documents that when the women in America went to work since the 1970s, they didn't do work outside the house because they freed up hours from their housework. They just added it. But you can't physically do that. You're exhausted. You can't hold, then, the family together. So what happened over the last 30 years since the 1970s? In the 1970s, if you watched a family program on television, it was all sugar and sweetness, nice daddy, nice mommy, 2 children, a dog, lots of toys, everybody quite happy. Today, you look at a program about a family, and you're presented with a dysfunctional family. The husband is pissed at the wife. The wife doesn't want to go near him. The children are mouthing off all the time. You know the story. We're just looking at the results of an economic shift. Americans are 5% of the world's population. We consume 65% of the psycho drugs, antidepressants, tranquilizers. What is that about? And by the way, the biggest consumer, adult American women. That might be connected to what has happened to them and to the pressures they're under. may have something to do with a 55% divorce rate, and that doesn't count all the people who don't live together anymore but don't go through the legal process of divorce. It traumatized our society. The only thing more bizarre than what we did to ourselves as a people by not dealing with this end of rising wages was to see how it became politically useful. The Republicans made the best of it. They became the champion of family values. They concocted the notion there were the good old days, and we should go back to the good old. We should get rid of everything that upsets the family. Sexy programs on TV, abortion, lots of things. To go back to the family that we have lost. Well, they were tapping into something real, and they made it work. Interesting, because the corporations who made out like bandits because they didn't have to raise wages anymore, funded the Republicans to celebrate the family values. Let's do that again. The people who were killing the family became the big supporters of the celebration of the lost family. Wonderful if you can do it. In this country, they did it. The second thing the American people did is they discovered that sending the women out to work and transforming the household brought in money because the wife and other people were doing more hours, but it didn't help because there were a whole new set of expenses. Wife had to have a second car. Wife had to have a whole another set of outfits. The family couldn't cook food for hours. They had to buy the food prepared. And you all know that that costs a lot more than making it yourself. When you added it all up, the extra was gone. So they had to do the one thing that's left for a working class. If they want to consume more, have a better standard of living, live the American dream, but they can't get any more wages, and they're exhausted. By the way, just a little statistic I love to quote. According to the OECD, a major international organization that collects these data, American workers do more hours of paid labor per year than any other working class in any advanced country. So if you're feeling tired, you should. And when you go to Europe and you wonder at the joy of French and Italian people who begin the evening meal with drinks at 5 o'clock and meander off to the restaurant and have a couple of olives and another glass of wine and a wonderful meal that ends at 11. And then you go home, if you can still stand, and you go home and you say, this is a fantastic culture. It's not got all that much to do with culture. French and Italian workers do 20% fewer hours a year in labor than Americans. They can take a long time for dinner because they have a long time for dinner. And the next time you hear a comparison between the standard of living of the American worker, what he or she gets, and what the Italian gets, make a little adjustment, which the newspapers in America don't do. The money they get, which is a little less than here, has to be balanced against the fact that for every 6 days you work, they work 5. And they have something you miss dearly: free time, leisure, time to be with other people you care about, and so on. Anyway, we couldn't handle it, so Americans did that last thing. They borrowed money. We became pioneers in a new way. We borrowed more money than any working class in the world has ever borrowed before, starting in the 1970s. We even invented new ways to get the mass of people into debt. The credit card. Before the 1970s, that was something the American Express, you remember, that businessmen and women, and a few of them, had as a kind of perk of their upper-level executive job. The mass of people had no such thing. You all have lots of them. In 30 years, we found a mechanism, pioneered, to get the mass of people deeply into debt, which the American people did. For 30 years, we kept the illusion of American prosperity because what was going on was debt, a mountain of debt, which made it possible. Of course, by 2007, after 30 years of this, we're done. We can't. We can't work more hours. We're not going to get more wages, and we are already carrying more debt than we can handle. So predictably, everything falls apart in 2007 as millions of people begin to realize they can't do it. And they have to stop paying somebody they owe money to, either the bank that they have the mortgage from, or the bank that they have the credit card from, or the college that they borrowed to get through. 30 years ago, the number of people getting debts to go to school was relatively small. Today, it's normal. Everything is done on debt. Well, you know, it doesn't take an advanced degree in economics, although I have that. But it doesn't take that to understand that if you're taking more and more debt on, but your wages are flat, you're going to hit a stone wall. That's why this crisis is serious. It's not your typical up and down. It's coming at the end of 30 years. Now the other side of the coin, very quickly. For 30 years, remember, wages are flat. Wages are flat, by the way, because America changes in the 1970s. First, we have a new technological innovation, the computer. Makes it unnecessary to have all kinds of people working because a machine will do that. Used to pay 100 people to keep inventory in a supermarket, to measure and watch how many boxes of Rice Krispies go off the shelf. Now you know as you check out, there's a little code and it little ticks off in a machine, and somebody in Boise, Idaho is looking at all the AMPs across America and knows exactly how many Rice Krispies have left the shelf in each store across the country. Thousands of people are gone. One person looks at a computer, and that was replicated. Number two, the American corporation began in the 1970s to understand that World War II and that peculiar period after it were over. The defeated countries had come back and were now producing again. Germany and Japan leading the way. And they were good. They knew how to recover from the disaster of a lost war. They knew the United States was in charge, so they knew what they had to do was to produce what the Americans produce better or cheaper, or else you had no chance at all. So they went to work and did that, which is why you drive a Toyota, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now the Americans, what are they going to do, the American corporations? They could have decided to try to change our technology. They could have done a lot of things. They didn't do that. They decided to move to where labor was cheaper. And so begins this massive exodus, still going on, moving production out of the United States to another part of the world. But if you're doing that, then you need fewer workers. The computer means you need fewer workers. The moving out of the country means you need fewer workers. And at the same time, the women are coming into the labor force. Less demand for labor, more supply of labor. We teach in economics, if the demand goes down, the supply goes up, the price goes nowhere. And that's what happened to the American worker. So for 30 years, we have a flat wage. What is the wage again? It's what the employer gives you for working. That's what a wage is. Meanwhile, what is it you give the employer? Because you probably noticed the employer doesn't give you a wage and say, thank you very much, have a nice day. They want something from you, labor. You got to work for 8 hours. Well, we in economics measure how much you produce per hour. It's called productivity. Government keeps records. So we know what happened over the last 30 years in labor productivity, how much the average worker in America produced for his or her employer. It went up every year. Why? Our workers are better educated, we have more machinery, we have better machinery, we've made technical breakthroughs, et cetera, all the usual reasons. So now with me, let's go. It's like television programs for children. If what the employer gives the worker is the same for 30 years, but what the worker provides for the employer goes up steadily for 30 years, what do you call that? Good news for the employer. Spectacular. Better news than anyone ever told these employers they would see when they were going through business school. This is a dream. For 30 years, we get more and more out of the worker as a corporation, as an employer, to sell. Well, we don't have to give the worker any more at all. More and more output per hour, flat wage. That's why for 30 years we've had a profit boom. Corporations in the 70s began noticing, and I worked with some of them. They began noticing they're making money hand over fist. They didn't have to raise the wages anymore. Workers were happy to keep the job with those wages. Now, what did business do? And what did the people that business hires to tell Americans what's going on, what did they do? Did they make the analysis I just did? Oh, no, no, no. Here's what they did. Here's what they did. First, big executives of corporations being told by the accountants, we're doing spectacular. We're making money. Wow. The corporation executives knew exactly what to say. This is because, they said, we are genius executives. Well, it's very important in America. We began to develop the cult of the smart executive. Remember names like Lee Iacocca or Jack Welch of GE fame. Lee Iacocca was an automobile executive. They went around and said, well, it's because of us. The same guy who hadn't made anything for 20 years was suddenly a genius. We were all supposed to believe that the sudden explosion of productivity was because of a sudden explosion of smarts among our executives? What kind of crapola was this? But when you thought about it for a minute, you realized what the real point of it was. Because if the exploding wealth of the employers had something to do with the genius of the executive, then it would make sense to pay them accordingly. So in the 1970s, we began this wonderful American, no other country has done this American inflation of the top executives' income. 2 or 3 years ago, in the middle of this crisis, Americans were horrified to discover that in the middle of every suffering, the big executives at Goldman Sachs and General Motors and so forth were taking home hundreds of millions of dollars. And Americans have been angry about it ever since. Look, I'm glad that we're angry about it. I'm glad Americans are angry. They're just 30 years late. This is a 30-year process. We are now wildly unequal as a society because we put so much money in the hands of the people at the top who walked away with this wonderful historical opportunity of flat wages and rising productivity. In the 1970s, the United States was a less unequal society than most of the other industrial societies. The gap between rich and poor was narrower here than in places like France and so forth. Now we are #1 in inequality. In 30 years, we've jumped over all the others to become the country in which the gap between rich and poor is the widest. And I've just given you the explanation of why that was. Okay, fast forward. What else did they do with their wealth besides pay themselves huge amounts of money? They developed a whole new industry. If you've got 100,000, 200,000 executives earning money like there's no tomorrow, they need people to manage these enormous fortunes. They're busy presiding over the company. So we have a new industry, the hedge fund. It runs around and collects these people and says, we'll manage your money for you. And they compete with one another to try to do it. And if you're a hedge fund, you're trying to compete to get this executive's 200 million and that executive's 80 million and these wild amounts of money, you have to offer good returns. Otherwise, they'll go to others, lots of hedge funds. So the hedge funds collect all this wealth and compete with one another, and they have to take ever greater risks in order to get the client. So we become more and more risky with this concentrated wealth at the top, which is why we had so many speculations that turned out to be no good. Banks making loans they shouldn't have to people who couldn't possibly pay back, because for a while it produced the illusion of good results and the money all rushed there. Typical of capitalism, when it has a profit period, it spins out into accumulation. What else happened with that wealth? American companies accelerated moving abroad. You know, to close a factory in New Jersey and open it in Shanghai is a very risky and difficult and expensive proposition. Suddenly, when corporations had all these profits, they could afford that. And so that process of leaving the United States accelerated. if these strike you as not very attractive outcomes of making some people very wealthy at the expense of everybody else, you've understood. Which is why we shouldn't have that, and why there should have been a debate about this change in our culture, rather than we all live through it in a kind of fog of not quite knowing what was going on. Well, then it blows up. The mass of people can't work anymore, can't borrow anymore. They haven't got the money to keep this going. And the people at the top have mis-speculated with that wealth that accrued in their hands. So the system collapses. 2007, 2008. In the last third of 2008, believe me, because I was involved a little bit with it, the people in Washington and in New York, which are the two cities that matter for this in the United States, all due respect, I appreciate all the other cities, but in this, they are not relevant. There was a feeling that it was going to collapse. I mean, the whole economic system, our credit system seized up. Nobody would lend money to anybody. Banks that had been doing business together for 50 years stopped speaking to each other because they didn't trust either of them could pay back any loan you might give them, so there was no movement. The economy tanked. And in those 4 months, particularly those last 4 months of 2008, shortly after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, if you were paying attention at the time, suddenly something spectacular happened, very rare in American history. The entire government, Republicans, Democrats, Bush is still in power as president at that time, everybody agrees right away what has to be done. And in a very short time, weeks, and in some cases these decisions were made in days, to spend trillions, with a T, trillions of dollars to get this credit system going. Because if you've understood what I've told you, everybody depends on credit. Every corporation, every household, every store, everything is about credit. If credit doesn't happen, if nobody's willing to take a chance to lend to anybody else, this economic system cannot continue. I mean, it stops. It stops as abruptly as events around that nuclear facility in Japan have to stop, because you can't continue life. And that was where we were in those 4 months of 2008. So the government, seeing the panic that could come, terribly afraid of what to do, all the Republican, Democrat, who cared, everybody got together and spent wild amounts of money. Where does the government get the money? No one cared. Because, well, they were right. If you didn't do it, then the discussion about how to do it would be academic in the worst sense of the word. Who cares? You had to bail everybody. You had to get the system fixed, and the only thing they could think of was to go to the banking system, the financial system of America, and basically say, okay, you are no longer in charge here. We are going to provide every bit of money anybody needs from now on. We are going to guarantee the debts of all the major banks, which is what they did. We are going to give the banks the money that they couldn't borrow from anybody else so they can keep functioning. In that time, the United States government did something which, like the flat wages, we could not talk about as a nation because of the Cold War leftover of what can and cannot be said in polite conversation. The United States nationalized the financial system of the United States. Those banks became, and many of them still are, government-supported entities. We socialized. We did what we think socialism is. That's what we did. We socialized our, well, I mean that. We poured money into every major bank. We gave them huge amounts of money, your money. That's what we did. We guaranteed their debts, which not only commits the money we have now, but commits your children and grandchildren to take care of this. This is a debt that's open-ended. The largest insurance company, which had written insurance policies for every financial transaction that couldn't be made anymore, called the AIG Corporation, they announced that they couldn't make good on their insurance policies. And so the government took them over and still runs them. We've poured $200 billion into that corporation alone. It's 80% owned by the United States. That is a socialized insurance company, the biggest in the world. We took over General Motors, which we still subsidize on a massive bit, and so on. Everybody was agreed. There was no significant dissent anywhere. anywhere. Where did the government get this money? Nobody cared. But we should have cared, because think a minute. There's really only three ways for a government ever to get money, to do anything. It either taxes people. It's one way to get it. But if you think Mr. Bush was low on popularity in the waning months of 2008, given everything what was happening, imagine the attitude towards the fellow if he had said, okay, we have to raise the money to bail everybody out, so every American family has to cough up another $18,000, which is roughly what it would have been. Poor Mr. Bush, he would have been lucky to make it out alive. That's why we can't finance our wars with taxes, because we don't like them anyway, and if we had to pay for them on top of fighting them, then the polls would be even more negative. But we don't do that. We do it with credit. So the government couldn't tax. Didn't see any way it could do that. Okay, that leaves two ways. You can print the money. Governments love to do that, because that's quick and that's cheap. It's just the paper. It doesn't cost much. So there were temptations in the government, and for those of you that pay attention, we have been printing money, lots of it. But we couldn't do all of the need that way, because that would make the whole world worried about the dollar. And that's very dangerous for us, because the world uses the dollar the way it uses no other currency. Over the last 30 years that the United States has been playing this game of flat wages and rising productivity, the government has never had the courage to tax anywhere near enough to pay for what the government does. The mass of people don't want to pay taxes, and the rich don't want to pay taxes. And the corporation can't afford to alienate either of those two, so it kind of plays the game, okay, I'll do what you want, and you won't have to pay. I'll borrow. And over the last 30 years, we've borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. And when the United States government borrows, it gets increasingly desperate to find somebody to lend. We are the world's biggest debtor, the United States. Nobody's even close. So we're the biggest debtor country in the world. And you might enjoy, just thinking about it, you might enjoy knowing, in case you hadn't heard, who the biggest foreign creditor is, because the United States, when it borrows abroad as well as at home. The People's Republic of China is the largest lender. So let me just, to help you see that you're in a new world, the #1 capitalist country in the world is in debt for $1.5 trillion, that's what the debt is, to the #1 communist country in the world. I know many of you are fond of that American pastime, second only to baseball, of celebrating how wonderful we are and how terrible the communists are. Think about it. Might be worth a moment's thought what it might mean, this situation. But it means also, among all the other things, that we can't play around with the dollar, because the rest of the world will be very angry if what they have, in this case the Chinese, and the #2 country that we owe money to is Japan, that these two countries would be very upset with us if we unilaterally devalue what they hold their wealth in, namely in dollars. So we couldn't do that. So what was left was borrowing. Borrowing needs a word. Bear with me. We borrow. Besides borrowing from other countries, like China and Japan, we also borrow, that is, our government borrows from Americans. You all know that, because many a day you've felt a knock on the door where you live, and there's an agent from the government saying, oh, you know, the government needs to borrow. Could you please lend us something? I'm trying humor here. That doesn't happen to you, because you're not rich enough. I hate to tell it to you, but the government doesn't want to spend time with little people like you and me, get $18.14, not interesting. So they borrow big amounts of money. Who do they borrow from? Wealthy individuals and large corporations led by banks. Those are the major people that lend to the government. This leads you to a wonderful conclusion. Over the last 30 years, and especially in the last 3, the government of the United States doesn't tax corporations and rich people. That's what I'm going to finish with in a couple of minutes. It doesn't tax them. Instead, it goes to them and it says, lend me the money, which corporations and rich people can do Because they didn't have to pay the taxes. The money they didn't give the government in taxes is what they lend to the government. And think of it as a rich person. This is something you do when you buy that lottery ticket, so you know how to do this. Imagine you're rich. You could be taxed by the government to cover a problem of the government. Then they'd come, take your money, say goodbye, and end of story. But they don't do that. They come instead and they say, give me the money. I won't tax it from you. Give it to me as a loan. I'll give it all back to you, and between now and when I give it back to you, I'll pay you interest too. If you were a wealthy individual or corporation, would you be against government borrowing? Yes, because Americans are easy in these areas to fool. The same politician and banker and corporate president who gets up on the appropriate days to give you a speech about the importance to living within our means, the government shouldn't be running deficits, has in his own portfolio lots of them because they're a very good investment. He's taken the money he hasn't paid in taxes and lent it to the government. The way you do that is to buy what's called a treasury security, an IOU of the government. That's how it's done. So the people giving you the speeches about what shouldn't happen are the ones making money off the fact that it happens. And if that sounds to you as though it might be hypocritical, then I've been clear in my presentation. That's what it is. So now we come to the crisis. The government has spent all this money. It's borrowed all this money. It's broke. Listen to Governor Walker in Wisconsin. We're broke. Governor Kasich in Ohio, we're broke. Governor Cuomo in New York, there's no money. We have to lay off 4,000 teachers, and we have to cut back on the nutrition program for pregnant women, and we have to. There's no money. Stop. What are you talking about? There's oodles of money. Money is the one thing we've generated for the last 30 years in wild profusion. What we haven't done is made sure that the government, to perform its normal functions, and especially its functions in a crisis to bail the system out, can tap that money in a reasonable way. So let's turn to the topic that Americans freak out about the most, taxes. Let's see whether there's money there and whether it's reasonable. Let's start with the federal government, and then we'll go to the state governments, and then I'll be done. Federal government. The biggest source of income for the federal government is the income tax. Everything else is small by comparison. There's two kinds of income tax, one on corporations and one on individuals. The income of a corporation is what we would normally call its profits, its net revenues, what's left over when you subtract the costs of doing business from the revenues you get from selling whatever the business is in business to produce. The United States government taxes that. It's considered a corporate income, and they have to pay an income tax, just like you and I have to pay an income tax on our wages and our salaries and our whatever other income that we have. Let's take a look at that. 50 years ago, the United States government got, ready, 50% more of its revenue from corporations' income tax than from individuals. In other words, corporations as a whole in America had to come up with 50% more than was taken from individuals. Corporations were the major support of the government's budget. What is the situation today? Corporations pay 1/4 of the amount that individuals pay. Do you understand the shift? That's not small, that's not little, that's not marginal. That's massive. The burden of the federal government has been taken off business steadily for 50 years and put on you. And on behalf of corporate America, thank you. Okay? Now let's take a look at the second thing. The big thing now is individual income tax, because the corporations have gotten out of it. When you heard Matt earlier say GE paid 2%, Goldman Sachs, or they get refunds, that's what you're tacking into. You're hearing, yeah, here are the particular examples of this enormous mega trend. Now let's look at the individual income tax. Same story. I tell you this only because my experience as a teacher of economics is that nobody knows this. In the 1960s and 70s, and there may even be some people here who paid income tax back then, so you'll remember. In the 1960s and 70s, well, I'll take one year as an example. 1970, I'll just pick it. In 1970, the top income tax bracket in the United States was 70%. Here's what that meant. If you were a single individual in 1970 in America, every dollar you earned over $100,000 a year, the rich people obviously, every dollar over $100,000, you ready? You had to give Uncle Sam 70 cents. You got to keep 30. If you think that's high, in the previous 15 years before 1970, the rate was most of those years 91%. Ready? Every dollar over $100,000 that you earned as a rich income earner, you had to give the government 91 cents, and you kept 9. Why? Because we had just been through a catastrophic depression and then World War II. And in those situations, the argument in America was we all have to pull together, and those who have the most have to contribute the most. And I want to remind you, this 91% before 1970 and 70% in the 1970s was endorsed by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, Republican Congresses and Nobody said boo politically. It was a universally supported rule in the United States. I'm not talking about Russia or China or Cuba or any place. We took it from the rich people. That's what we did. What is the rate, the top rate on the income tax in the United States today? 35%. Okay? That's an income tax drop, you ready? For the richest. From 91% in the 60s to 35% now. That is a tax cut. You have never seen anything like that. Nothing like that happened for the vast mass of the American people, not even close. So what do we have over 50 years? We have a massive shift of the burden of taxation at the federal level from corporations to individuals and from the richest to all of you. So funds who got all that money dumped on us as a kind of economic tsunami, bailed out by the government with our money. Now we are going to be told we have to take fewer government services, watch our neighbors and friends who work for the government as teachers and social workers and firefighters and police officers, they all to lose their job. You've got to be kidding. In fact, as an outsider looking at this, it strikes me that if I were an advisor to the Republican Party, I'd tell them, be very careful here. You are pushing too far. You're going to get a backlash that you're going to be real sorry. As people's conditions keep deteriorating, which all of these programs make, for sure, where's that anger from all of that going to go? Over the last weekend in the Wall Street Journal, this last week, the Wall Street Journal has a weekend edition, covers Saturday and Sunday. So it would have been 26, 27 or something like that of March. There's a wonderful story on the inside that the Republican Party in Ohio is beginning to have second thoughts because their polls show voters are angry at them. Are angry at them because they see this now. They're beginning to get a sense that in a time of unemployment, laying off public employees would make the unemployment worse. And during a time of unemployment and people without homes, we need more government service and help, but you're reducing it. That doesn't sound so good. And what's supposed to happen? Wonderful, good things, but they're not happening to me. This is very dangerous for them. Not that I worry on their behalf all that much, but it is a sign that something And the Wall Street Journal wanted to make a story, wanted us all to see that those Republicans are getting worried. And that's, I suspect, because the Wall Street Journal is getting worried. And I think that that's a sign, too, of the very same things that we're all saying. Of course the money's there. We don't have a problem of taxation in the United States. We have a problem of who is taxed and who isn't. We are at the end of a 30-year period where the gap between rich and poor has become unbelievable. In the hands of the rich is concentrated an enormous resource that could and used to be made available to solve problems in this country. We have a national economic crisis. What better reason, what better historical precedent than now to go to where the wealth is so that it can help get us through? We're not doing that. And it is not happening on a scale that is so overwhelming that the really interesting question, which all my friends from Europe keep emailing me about, is why isn't something happening in your country? What's the matter with you? You know, what are you American? What's wrong with you? One example, because it offends me so deeply. There's a debate been going on for weeks. Many of you have maybe watched it or gotten bored by it. It's Republican officials in Washington talking about they have to cut the budget by $66 billion. That's what the House, the Republicans have now control of the House of Representatives. The House is in favor of a $66 billion cut. And the Democrats, no, the Democrats controlling the Senate only wants 33, 66 versus 33. Friends, the deficit this year, the gap between what the government is spending, $3.5 trillion, and what it raises in taxes, about $2 trillion. That's a $1.5 trillion gap. That's what's being borrowed from wealthy people here and from the People's Republic of China, putting this country further and further in debt. If you're dealing with a deficit of $1.5 trillion, and your two major parties are debating 66 versus 33, that's like having a fight with a person trying to mug you, in which the issue is how many of the pennies in your shoe he will get. That's irrelevant. What the Democrats and Republicans are doing, they're counting on you all to think that 33 billion sounds like a lot, and 66 billion, that sure sounds like a lot, and we're fighting and we're arguing. What is important is both parties are perfectly happy to run a $1.5 trillion deficit. They both agree on that. There's no dispute whatsoever, no debate about it, no discussion of who's going to get all of the interest payment on that money. You're all going to pay for that to pay the interest to the people who have it. You don't own those bonds. You just pay interest. But the rich who don't get taxed, they buy the bonds. That's what they do with that money that they don't pay in taxes. By the way, all my rich friends, and I do some consulting with corporations and so on, they all are explaining that to me. This American economy is too shaky, they say. I'm not going to invest in the United States economy. That's not a good investment. I'm going to park my money in Treasury securities. I'm going to take the money I don't pay in taxes and lend it to the government. That's what they're doing. And that's not a productive use of this. That's not going to build our economy. That's for the government to use to keep things from collapsing further. So what you're watching in Washington is a game, a theater of the absurd, in which the two contenders aren't contending at all. Last point. And this is, if I leave you with this, you may get depressed, but then again, everything I've told you tonight might lead you there, but you'll see where I go with this. For 30 years, American corporations moved production out of the country. In the last 5 or 10 years, something new has happened, and that is really serious for us going forward. American corporations continue to move production abroad, but the new thing is that's where they see their future markets growing. That's new. It means that American corporations have not only decided to produce out of the country, but that the growth, the future, where they should spend their money marketing, where they should spend their money for advertising, where they should plan on their growth is outside the United States too. What does that leave the United States? It leaves us with a set of corporations for whom the rest of us are decreasingly relevant and important. They're more interested in making sure that laws get passed in Europe or Asia or Africa or Latin America than those laws get paid. If the roads deteriorate here, it's less urgent than making sure there are good roads elsewhere so their trucks can travel. Their interest in this society is shrinking. And the American holiday of 150 years of rising wages, our empire, economic as well as political, has never in my lifetime seen as shaky and the future as grim as it does now. The people in charge are making the money. They'll make the money abroad as well as they make it here. American icons like Pepsi-Cola already make more than half their profits outside the United States. They're an American corporation, but they know what they depend on, and they depend more on the rest of the world than they do on this society. And their politics and their ideology and their planning come from that. They're doing what they do. They're making a lot of money in China and everywhere else. And they're paying the dividends to the people rich enough to participate in the corporation. But it's leaving the mass of the American people more and more out of the loop. And that has more to say about the future of this country than anything else. Only the people here can stop that. If there isn't a change, if Matt Renner's comment of a tipping point in a change, if that's not true, I hope it is, but if it isn't, then we're not going to see a major change. We're going to see more going down this road that has now been in effect for 30 years and hasn't even been derailed by a fantastic crisis that the whole world shook for a long time around. But I don't want to leave you with the thought that people aren't doing something. That's what we get back, whether it's the story about Portugal I told you or the thing in Wisconsin. But the story I'm going to end with is about something that happened a while back, but that Americans don't know. And it's about Americans who made a difference. One state in the United States, out of 50, made a decision early on in the crisis, early in 2009, not to do what California is doing, its neighboring state, not to do what Cuomo is doing here, not to do what Walker and Kasich and the others are doing. It's the state of Oregon, for those of you who don't know. In 2009, here's what happened. The legislature began considering a bill, and the bill went like this. We in Oregon are not going to do what our sister state, California to the south, Washington to the north, what they're doing. We are not going to cut public services. We're not going to lay off any public workers. They faced the same problem every state did. With a crisis of unemployment, with a crisis of home foreclosures, the revenues coming to states collapse. Unemployed people don't pay income tax because they don't have an income. And people who are in a crisis cut back on expenditures because they're scared, and so they pay less sales tax, and that's what states depend on. So every state is in trouble. Every state is having less money. They could, of course, go to the corporations and the rich, but they don't. But Oregon is the exception. And I tell this story because it certainly must be true that if this could happen in Oregon, then it sure could happen lots of other places. It's summertime 2009. The legislature has a bill which says we're not going to cut services, we're not going to lay off all people. How are we going to deal with the cutback of our revenues? We're going to tax corporations and we're going to tax the rich. I kid you not. And they do that, and they want to tax everybody who earns over $250,000. Any family that earns over $250,000 a year has to pay a big increase, and any family that earns over $500,000 a year has to pay a whopping big increase. It passes the first house of the legislature. People are amazed. It passes the second house of the legislature. People are more amazed. The bill is sent to the governor, who signs it. In other states, that's the end of the story, but not in the West. In the West, they take seriously these ideas, you know, that we give lip service to democracy and all that. So in Oregon, like in other states, here's the law. If a group of people, and it doesn't have to be very large, goes around and collects signatures, they can force any bill that has passed the legislature and been signed by the governor to be put up for a vote by the people as a whole. And the people decide. In other words, if the people vote against that bill, Their will overwhelms the governor and the legislature. The bill is void, and I think they can't even allow to bring it up again for a year. So in other words, the people overrule the governor and the legislature. Okay, so you could imagine after the governor signed it, the Republicans and the business community went nuts, predictably, and they gathered the signatures very quickly. They were able to do that. And that required then a date to be set. I believe the date was the 10th of January, 2010. On that day, after months of campaigning by the two sides, 1.2 million people, citizens of Oregon, went to the polls. You know why I'm telling you the story. They voted decisively in favor of the law, so Oregon is not doing what the rest of the United States is doing. And if you don't know that story, then that's a lesson to you in how the media in this country work. You don't know. Even though nothing could be more relevant for all of you that are considering, for example, what the government of the state of New York is now doing, nothing could be more relevant than the question, why aren't we doing, or at least debating doing, what Oregon did? Oregon is, in case you didn't know, part of the US of A. And so it might be reasonable to take it as a model, or at least as an image, of what we could do. Even if there weren't an Oregon, we should be discussing it, but we actually have a place. When Americans get mobilized and clear that it's kind of gone too far and they want to make a basic change, they have shown themselves able to do that. It's scary. We have a long tradition of time when thinking like this and talking like this got you labeled with words I won't repeat because you all know them anyway. But what may surprise a lot of you is that those times are over, for better or for worse. And the best example is me, because I go all around the country talking like this. And instead of people looking at me funny and worrying that they're in the same room, they keep inviting me. And I'm having a wonderful time. Thank you very much for your attention. And now, as Matt explained, if you have comments, questions, expressions of outrage, there are mics. And so if you do it that way at the mic, or you'll bring the mic around, then everybody can hear the questions, or the comments, or the whatever.
Hi, Professor Wolff. I'm Jeannie Meyer. We've met before. I have a couple of questions and comments. First is that I don't know if you know this, but at the time that productivity and wages uncoupled, so did the lowering of the ranks of unionized workers. Mm-hmm. And in fact, today, the level of people in private sector unions is lower than it was before the Wagner Act in 1935. Right. It is lower, and I believe that part of the success in this creating the structural inequality has been an attack on labor unions and the attack on labor, and it should be mentioned. I'm sure you agree. Yes. But I also have been following this group called the Robin Hood Tax Group. I don't know if you know them, but they're talking about if you go to their website, robinhoodtax.org, there's like a little video of a banker being asked, why don't you go and pay a financial transactions tax? And they say, oh, how much would that be? And it goes down, he's basically like, oh, less than 1%, and how many would that make? It would be like hundreds of billions of pounds. Anyway, right. I think that I can't believe that nobody has raised this issue of a financial transactions tax, because I frankly think that it's the rich that got us into this, and that's where, if there's going to be revenue, it should be from there. So I'd like your view on that. Okay.
The numbers, for those of you that are interested, in the private sector of the United States, according to the United States Department of Labor, 6.9% of workers are in a union. So 93 0.1% of the workers in the private sector of the United States are not members of and are not bargained for by any trade union. So it's really crucial for you to understand that arguments about the danger or the cost or the burden of trade unions is silly. It's just a joke. The only amazing thing is the ability of the American people to take it seriously when the newspaper says it. Even in the public sector, which is much more organized, it's still below 1/3. So the vast majority of public employees are likewise ununionized. Unions in the United States are unspeakably small, poor, and weak. The idea that they represent a counterforce to corporations requires that you know nothing about what I just said, since it's an impossible argument to sustain given this situation. So, yeah, absolutely, trade unions have been on a 50-year slide. Here's even before the last 30 years, it basically goes back to their high point in the mid-50s if you look at the numbers, and it's been going down ever since. It's a very sad story, to say the least. The importance of this, if I could just take a moment, we had, in the 1930s, 3 significant kinds of organizations speaking up for working people. By far the most important was the trade union movement. We had a wave of unionization in the depths of the Depression. I want to remind you all, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO part of the AFL-CIO. The CIO swept across American industry in the 1930s, organizing millions of workers into trade unions. It startled everybody. It created an organizational framework. All those workers giving a little bit for their union dues produced the money and the backbone and the mass of people. That's why this crisis is different from the 1930s. In 1933, a president, Roosevelt, who had been elected as a balanced budget advocate, a conservative Democrat, coming from one of the richest and most established families in the United States, the Roosevelts, abruptly turns around, goes on the radio, and he says, by the way, the unemployment in 1933 when he does this is 25%. 2.5 times what it is now. So he goes on the radio and he says, if the private sector in America either cannot or will not hire millions and millions of Americans who want to work, then there's no alternative but for me and the federal government to do that. Between 1934 and 1941, the federal government created and filled 11 million jobs. Now, why do I tell you this? We're in a crisis now, not as bad, but very, very bad, with millions of people out of work or suffering part-time work or being, dissuaded from even looking anymore. Not only do we not have a federal jobs program, nobody proposes it. No one debates it. The president never mentions it. It's as if it didn't happen in our country. Why is that? Because we don't have any organizations that will force Mr. Obama to do what those organizations forced Mr. Roosevelt to do in the 1930s. And there were 3 organizations, I told you. Trade unions were the biggest. But dare we say it, because it's our history. So was the Socialist, and so was the Communist Party. If you know anything about the history of that time, particularly if you come from the New York area where those organizations were strong, I want to remind you, we had, as a result of the power of these organizations, we had 2 interesting things here in New York that you may not know about. One, we had proportional representation. We had elections in which you got a seat on the city council in New York according to the number of people who voted for you. If 5% of the people voted for you, 5% of the city councilmen. We had what Europe has now. We had it. And because we had it, an African-American communist was elected to the city council of New York. Way back then, Benjamin Davis. If you never heard that, go read up on it. It's in all the history books. The people of New York elected a black communist to the city council. And you think Americans can't do something unusual? That counts as that would count as unusual now, wouldn't it? And imagine it back then when Jim Crow and all that stuff was still part of our culture. So you had organizations, socialists, communists, but above all the trade unions. All of the communists and socialists have virtually disappeared. And the trade unions are on a 50-year slide. Of course we don't have the kind of pressure on our president to do what even a fellow like Roosevelt was willing to do, let alone to go further. So yeah, the story of the trade unions and how they got caught up in that is absolutely crucial.
I want to start by thanking you for singing my song and doing it in such an erudite way. But I'm really interested in what you think of the way of the unemployment situation, the jobs. There is, regardless of the financial situation, definitely an enormous loss of jobs due to the computerization of work. And I'm asking where? Though they talk about new technologies, creating jobs, but those too are highly computerized. Where do you think a high degree of employment will come from that will return America to a high employment economy?
Sure. Before I answer, there is something I should say. I don't want to be understood as arguing that we ought to have this or that law, this or that regulation, this or that change in the government. I could come up with them like I just did in terms of the government employing people. But frankly, I don't think those are sufficient. Something much more fundamental has to happen. In the 1930s, we did all those things. We put people to work. In case you don't know, and because it's partially an answer to your question, one of the most creative things we ever did as a nation happened then. We decided that if we're going to give all these jobs to people, let's do something that really transforms the United States. And one of the things they did then was a program called the WPA. The government went and it said to everybody who has any artistic skill, can you sing? Can you draw? Can you act? Can you sculpt? Do you read or write poetry? Didn't matter. Come and we'll give you a job. And here's what we'll do. We'll put you into troupes, an acting troupe, a poetry troupe, creative writing troupe, whatever it was. And we will pay you to do your artwork, but to do it in a way where we'll move you all around the United States, particularly the cities and towns where they don't have an orchestra or poetry, so that the children and the adults can get culture brought to them by the That was the greatest distribution of culture to the American people we had ever had before and that we have ever had since. We were a creative people. We transformed an unemployment program into something that not only gave people a job, but transformed everybody else's life. That was what could happen if you had trade unions, socialists, and communists working with a government that responded. So what would we do to get this again? All of that was undone. All of that was undone. Just like the rules governing what banks could and couldn't do that were passed in the 30s were undone later. If we don't change the basic structure of this society, that's the message, then even when we have a crisis, we won't get the right response. And even if we get the right response, it won't be secure. It'll be undone by the same unequal organization in which masses of people produce what the profits are for a very small number. As long as you keep that situation that way, you can't be surprised if those with the wealth who keep collecting it make sure that they stay in that position by shaping the culture and shaping the politics. What could we do now? Here's some examples. There's a lot of people who understand that we are despoiling our planet. There's talk of things like a green revolution, but let's be very practical. We ought to have a decent public transportation system across the United States, whether it's buses or trams or trolleys or street railways. That That's an enormous project, will take huge numbers of people, but it will make us not the bullshit, if you pardon my technical language, about getting independent of foreign dependence on oil. If you don't want to be dependent on oil, or worse still, nuclear energy, the way to do it is not to fool around with which way you grab stuff out of the earth. It's to stop using these crazy amounts of energy that we don't need. Public transportation, as 8,000 studies will show you, takes much less energy to move a person a mile in a public transportation system than if we all have these individual SUVs gobbling it all up. Same thing, if we design our housing different and live in units and groups, we don't need, the heating is infinitely cheaper than if we otherwise do. There's 100 examples like that where there's jobs, number one. Number two, it is a scandal in this society what we don't do in the way of quality daycare provided by the government to free up the adults who are already working more than they can and can hardly manage this situation. That's jobs for millions of people because it's a personal service job. You don't want an adult to be responsible for more than a relatively small number of children to give them the attention and the affection that they need. Come on, a humane collection of 5 of you in this room could design a decent program that would give millions of people a job. Number 3, we have an aging population. The number of us that are becoming, as you can see, at an advanced age, what's going to happen to those people? We are sticking huge numbers of them in unmentionable nursing homes where the last years of their lives are made into a horror. We periodically have an expose as if we needed it, but we damn well know, if we're honest, that we're getting older and older. We're taking away people's Social Security. That's what we're doing, making them even more desperate as they get older. This ought to be turned around in a humane way. That's, again, millions and millions of jobs. I don't think it's a problem. We live in a society now that has, by conservative estimate, 25 million people not working to the amount that they want. The government keeps a statistic called a capacity utilization. What proportion of our tools, equipment, and factories is being used and what is sitting idle? It's currently at around 70 to 75%. What that means is 1/4 of our productive capacity, tools, equipment, machines, is sitting there gathering rust and dust. We got millions of people. We got all the equipment, materials, raw materials for them to work with, and we desperately need the output to make our society better, but we live in a capitalist system that cannot put these things together. If there was ever an argument that we ought to be open to asking questions about this system because it isn't delivering the goods. Capitalism used to be defended by people who said, it delivers the goods. Okay, if you rise by that argument, you have to fall by it too. Capitalism is delivering bads, lots of them, to lots of people for long periods of time. Cold War is over. Maybe we can again grow up and ask the question any sane society does. Is the economic system we got the best we can do? And if it isn't, then say thank you for what capitalism achieved, and it achieved plenty. But move on and ask about other ways of organizing a society. If we don't do that, we will have ourselves, in a sense, to blame. So I think there are lots of ways to put all those people to work, where the technology would help us, not be an obstacle. You should sort of get a mic, yeah, good.
Hi, Dr. Wolff.
Hi.
I'd like to ask you a question about the Fed, quantified easing program of the Fed, and
Yes.
The stimulus. Now, you spoke about the terrible housing crisis that's reemerged.
Right.
But there's also the horrible used car scam that's really a replication of the banking crisis. The same kind of toxic mortgage, toxic loans are being laid on people, and that bubble is about to burst, I think.
Yep.
And then there's a third problem, and that is the horrible scam of student loans, where millions of students in this country have been turned into debt peons with no possibility of bankruptcy, thanks, by the way, partly to that dimbo Biden, who pushed for all these changes in the bankruptcy laws. So it's obvious that what we need I mean, we need a radical social transformation of society. It's so obvious. But what we need, at least for now, is another stimulus, and a real stimulus, even more than the moderate amount of monies that were poured into the economy in 2009. I'm asking you whether or not Bernanke and our Reaganite apparently supply-side president have the moral courage or even the insight to recognize that these things are needed, given what's coming.
From best I can tell, and I know some of these people because the world of economics is not that large, and the world of economics of folks who went to the right schools. I don't often explain this, but I will explain it now because it's part of the story. There's two kinds of economists in the United States. There are those in the large number who went to the usual schools that teach that. And then there is what we basically call the old boy network. And the old boy network are those economists who went to a list of, I don't know, 20 schools. You all know their names. It exists in all disciplines, but it certainly exists in economics. So I went to all those schools, and so I know all these people. They're not happy about that. I didn't turn out right as far as they're concerned. But I do know them, and they know me, and it creates awkward moments from time to time. I think, I say therefore, I can answer your question. Bernanke understands what's going on. He is frustrated. If you want to understand what Bernanke's frustrations are, then just read Mr. Krugman. This is all the same thing. What Krugman says it. Bernanke cannot. Why? Because the political muscle at this point of the highly concentrated wealth is such that they don't believe they need to slow down this juggernaut. How can I put this to you? I can't tell you how many times I've been in the meeting of a corporate board of directors where half of the corporate boards of directors, usually about 15 to 20 people. So half of them in the room are saying, look, we have cut wages, we have cut benefits. These workers don't do anything. They'll cut some more. What's the problem? There's a lot of noise, but they don't do anything. Their unions are weak. They're worried about their job. They go for it. Then there are other members of the board who are just as loyal to the company as the first group, who say, don't keep pushing, because one day you'll push too far, and then the whole game will be gone. Don't be an idiot. Stop. We've done real well. We don't have to go the net. This is normally a debate. What has happened in the last 30 years is that the conservative ones, the first group, they keep proving that they're right. They keep pushing, and they get away with it. And they push some more, and they get away with it. So they solve the problems of a corporation, which are many, by sticking it to their employees in one way or another, and they think they can do it. At this point, they think they could have a crisis, they could get the government to save them, and they could make the mass of people pay for it. That's what they think. And they're the majority, and they're not going to stop. They can't get over the idea. They expected, many of them, that when this crisis hit, they would have to give up things because they were culpable. They are ecstatic. They don't have to give up anything. They can make further, they can turn the crisis from being a flaw of capitalism that they're going to have to pay for into a flaw of unions that they can stick it to. They can't get over. I've been with them. It's like being in a bar and you had one too many. Suddenly everything is very, very funny. You know, every joke, however old and tired, it breaks you up. For these people, they're in a moment, they're just taken with it. And they want nobody to tax them. They want the people to accept cutbacks instead of taxing them. They're sitting on more wealth than they've ever seen before. They're not paying any taxes. They have 86,000 ways even to get out of the low rates that they face. Nobody is saying boo about it. Everybody's discussing, who do we cut? Should we take all of the remaining money away from the National Public Radio? They don't care about this. Or give a few more bucks to Planned Parenthood. They don't care about. By the way, the majority of these people support Planned Parenthood. These are not right-wing people. They're not. That's a mistake. They hate the Tea Party. I can't repeat in this audience the words about the Tea Party that I hear, you know, on Wall Street. They think those people they're afraid of them. Those are crazy people for them. I am strange. They're crazy. That's really the answer. They can't stop this. They're afraid of how far this is going to go, but they're on the ride. You know, that's how empires end. You do it too much. We are now a country, for those of you that haven't noticed, which I'm sure is nobody, we are now entering the fourth war against Muslim country. Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Libya. You got to be crazy what you're doing here. But you're on a roll of a certain sort. The way it works, it seems you got to do this too, and then you suddenly discover, uh-oh, I can't do this. But it's, you know, you painted yourself into a corner. I think they are not going to touch any of these things. They convinced they can now weather it. Let the bubble in securitized student loans or securitized auto loans. Let the bubble burst, which it very well may. A lot of people are saying that it's coming. They're just convinced they will get another bailout of because that's what Americans do it. They watch the government, they endorse the government, and the government says, okay, you now have to pay for this. Oh, I do. Let me get angry at the public employee. That is an amazing trip. To find yourself in the middle of a global crisis that the public employees in the state of Wisconsin probably had relatively little to do with, and to go after them as the great problem. It's an extraordinary achievement of our political system to turn it. And I think that folks like Bernanke, they understand this. And they're nervous, very nervous about it. But they're stuck in the political world of Washington, and Washington is a political world sustained by the wealth. Put yourself in this situation, you know, which is an enjoyable moment. Imagine you were one of these wealthy corporate leaders, and you understood, because your accountant explained to you, that you were now worth $300 million, and you were part of a charmed circle, and there were a lot of you in America like this, and they all live in Greenwich just like you do, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You would not require much tutoring to understand this is dangerous. You're sitting with all this in a society where the mass of people don't have anything like that and no prospect of getting it. You better be careful. And one of the first things you better do is shape the culture of this society so that you're not positioned as the bad guy, and to control the politics so that the people who still have the right of a mass voting don't vote in the people who they would then want to take away from you. This is not, no rocket science here. So you move into the political sphere. When I told you before that Americans in the last 30 years, faced with flat wages, turned in on themselves, turned away from politics. They did. There's that wonderful book I always recommend for those of you that are book readers. A Harvard professor in sociology named Bob Putnam wrote a book with a title you'll never forget because it's funny. It's called Bowling Alone. It was a bestseller for a while. But the point about Bowling Alone was he studied the Americans who stopped participating in civic affairs, who stopped going out with friends, who stopped being in a bowling league so that when they went bowling, they bowled alone because they weren't with anybody. That withdrawal of the American working class as it did all this work and took on all this debt and got stressed out and emotionally upset by all the transformations we've been talking about, when people turned away from political life of participation, when all those urban political machines kind of faded out, in came the money. The very money they were creating at the top moved in because it needed now to control the political situation, because it's hard to keep a system like this. Look at the fascination of the United States with Egypt and the wealth of Mubarak against the poverty of the masses. My wife's a psychotherapist. The first thing she said is Americans are all projecting. They can't talk about it at home, so they're fascinated when it's somewhere really far away. It was her way of realizing with this extraordinary, intense engagement with a country whose name you can't spell. What is that? Because it's a morality play. It's like a drama that you see yourself reflected in. Jen, where are you?
Just one more short question. Sorry, over here.
You mentioned the problem with Oregon, and no one knows about what happened there. The corporate press doesn't want to advertise that. I would wonder if you could tell us something about how people can find out all the social benefits that are in Europe and those advanced Western countries that you spoke about. They never talk about the things that those people have.
Right.
And I was wondering how you can help us to find out what they have in Norway and France and Italy and all those social benefits that those people have.
Right.
As well as the defined pension seem to be going the way of the dodo bird. They're replacing it with the 401k and 403b.
Right.
And I'd like you to speak about that and the possibility of having defined pensions that would go with you from job to job. Is that possible?
Right.
Thank you.
All those things exist in those European countries. Let me mention just a few. And the way to learn about it is to make use. Technology always cuts both ways. The internet is a wonderful place. It's very quick. Do your little Google game and find out what the social benefits or the social welfare system is in France or Italy or Germany or Sweden. It's not hard to do, but let me give you just a taste. The law in France, the minute you go to work, after you finish your high school or college, you have a paid job, your employer is required by law to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation. That's the law. Let me just repeat that. The law in France is you must get 5 weeks paid vacation. Try to think. Most Americans will not get 5 weeks paid vacation, ever. But if they're lucky, maybe in the last 18 months, the employer, in addition to giving you a cheap watch, will give you such a vacation, but probably not. Let me give you another example, public health. Every one of the European countries has a national public health program. They produce health outcomes that are better than those in the United States, longer life expectancy, lower infant mortality, and all the rest, and they spend much, much less money per person on their health care with better outcomes. Anyone looking at these systems would be able to say, goodness gracious, something approximating what all these other countries do. I mean, it is possible, if you listen to the AMA and other groups in the United States, to conclude that our system is much, much better than theirs. And that would require you then to conclude as well that everybody over there is a raving moron. Because they all seem to want and to maintain, even with conservative governments, their national health service. Nobody dares mess it. Sarkozy, who, by the way, it's a name for you not to remember since he is gone. The people of France, I mean, their attitude towards it, he's in worse shape than Mr. Bush in his worst moments was. And that's saying a lot. And right behind him, heading into the toilet, is Mrs. Merkel in the Germany next door. And those are the two key countries. And both of them are being defeated by the rage against austerity. That's what's driving them out. And so a very different situation from here. So the public health service there is extraordinary. I know France best because my family is partly French. When you are born, when you have a child, the government will send a person to work with you for the first 4 or 5 years. You don't have to have them, but it's a government service. They will help you. They will teach you all about caring for the baby and everything else, but they will give you time and help. When I taught in France for a while as a visiting professor at the University of Paris, and my colleagues who brought me there as a visiting professor had at that time a young child, a little girl, Sandrine, which is a very popular French name, and she was about 7, and he was an economics professor like I at the university there. And they could bring her as early as 7 o'clock in the morning and pick her up as late as 7 in the evening, or any period within that they wanted. She had her own outfit that the school the daycare center provided in school. after-school programs for her and so forth. And the family paid $21.50 a week, and they had it 6 days a week. And that's in the middle of Paris, and that's across the city. So it's a level of public services that is completely different. You also ought to understand, for some of you don't get this, that in France there are no private universities. All the university system is public. And when you ask them, gee, how come you don't have private universities like we do in America? And they look at you as if you're nuts, and they explain, If you have private as well as public, then you have a two-track system. It's unequal. And we don't, that would be they look at you as if with wide eye, that would be undemocratic. Of course, everybody should be equal in school, and so there are no private schools. Bingo. Also, to go to a public school, to go to the University of Paris, costs you the lofty sum of $200 a year. Then 200. Now, to be fair, they don't have the kind of vast university system that we do, so a much smaller percentage of college-age people in France go to the university. So it's not, their program is free, basically, for students, but it doesn't take in anywhere near the size that we do. But then again, what we call university, they wouldn't consider that. They do it, well, it's true. If you know what their system is, they do, in France, for example, it's called the baccalaureate. To do that is to do the equivalent of what we do here in the first couple of years of college. So you have to adjust it, but it's a many more social benefits than you have here across the board. It's just a different society. And in Germany, let me give you some examples in Germany. I can see from your faces you're interested. This gentleman asked a very important question. In Germany, a factory cannot leave a community. A factory cannot leave a community. In order for a factory to shut down and move to another place, it has to get a vote of approval from the trade union and a vote of approval from the city council in the community where it exists. If it leaves without doing that, its property is seized by the government. It's a criminal act. Can't do it. I'll give you another example. If you have more than 2,000 employees in Germany, half the board of directors have to be workers from the plant. Now, they're still capitalist societies, and they have a lot of problems. But you sense right away the power of mass organizations, trade unions, socialist parties, and communist parties, and nowadays also green parties, which are strong in these countries, and a new thing, parties that are called anti-capitalist. France has two of them. Germany's most amazing new political party is a party called the Left, Die Linke. In German, that's what the left means. They got 12% of the vote in the last national election. 1 out of 8 Germans voted for them. And here's their slogan: Germany can do better than capitalism. So, to give the basic answer, use the internet. You can learn all about, all these countries have information about themselves, and where you can learn about all of this and how they work. It's a remarkable story there of, even within capitalism, the conditions of life of working people will be very different if they have organizations fighting for them than if they don't, and their ability to hold on. When I was a professor in France, I remember once an effort was made by a conservative government, it was in the middle 1990s, to reduce, I forgot to mention this, to reduce the subsidy for children. In France, if you have a second, third, fourth, fifth child, you get money for each extra child. You get a direct cash, everybody gets it. It's just to help you with large families. You all got that? Good, good. That's been the law for 50 years in France, maybe longer. And there was an effort by the conservative government to slightly reduce the support for, it's called famille nombreuse, large families in French. And there was a demonstration. I came out of the hotel where I was being put up while I was a professor, and there was a demonstration, and I'm the kind of person, I've never seen a demonstration I didn't want to be part of, so I went immediately into the demonstration, and I've spoken French since I've been a child. So the first thing that struck me as an American was that where I entered the thing was a group of Catholic nuns. France is a Catholic country, and they were carrying big banners about how parish saint, whatever it was against the government doing this. And they were busily chattering and handing cookies to the line behind them, which was the Communist Party officials of that district. And they were all friends, and they were in this demonstration together. 2 days later, the government withdrew the bill. You can't, what are you going to do? Every French family has got somebody who's a socialist or a communist in it. You can't do what we have in this country. You can't demonize, because that evil communist, that's Aunt Louise, the one who comes to the picnic and hands leaflets between the sandwiches. You know, that's what she does. You can't do it. You can't do it. You should remember, by the way, that the politics in Europe are very strange. The government pushing austerity in Greece is a government of the Socialist Party. Yorgos Papandreou, of a long socialist family. His grandfather was the prime minister of Greece. His father was the prime minister of Greece. These are socialists doing the austerity and being pushed back. In the government that fell in Portugal that I told you about before, that fell last week, the name of the prime minister, you'll love this, is Jose Socrates, like the Greek. Jose Socrates was prime minister of the Socialist Party, which was thrown out of office by an alliance of the communists and the conservatives. So that's another sign that the conventional world that we've all been living in for a long time is coming to an end. The thing on pensions, last point, I know we've run out of time. We used to have pensions where the whole point of the pension was to say, if you give a lifetime of work to whoever you work for, private or public, then there's a kind of a commitment. We're going to take a bunch of money out of your check every week, but we're going to put it aside, and we, the employer, are going to guarantee that between the money, which is your money that we've taken, and how we've invested it, you have a guarantee. You will be taken care of in a decent way in your old age, and you will not be a burden on your children. That was the whole point. And it came out of the 1930s, the big fight. There were no pensions before that. Social Security came out of the Great Depression. Notice, a Great Depression gave people a real good benefit. In this depression, we're taking things away from people, okay? The difference. What's happening now is that the business community doesn't want that, because they don't want to be stuck with the obligation in case their investments didn't turn out real good with your money. They don't want to have to pay you off in the way that you had been promised. So what they do now is they say, we'll take your money, but what you get depends on how well the investment in the stock market goes. That means your future life as a retired person becomes a crapshoot. You're now a gambler with your own future. You'll do nicely if the stock market goes up, and you'll be in deep doo-doo if it doesn't. That's not a commitment to people that comes out of honoring their lifetime of work. That's making them gamble about their own future. And the irony here is that younger people don't think that's their issue. But it is your issue. Because if your parents are not able to take care of themselves when they're old, either you're going to be a monster and dump them in a nursing home. Well, that's an option. A lot of people take that option. Or you're going to have to take your own difficult situation and help them. And that, it was to avoid the tension and the pain inside families to create a pension, and that is being taken away, because over the last 3 years, it's not much discussed, there's been a massive change away from defined benefit. You get a certain defined benefit to defined contribution. What's defined is how much you put in, but it's an open question, how much you get out. And that, again, is an assault on the working class of the country. So think about this uncut movement. It's one of many movements that's happening around the United States where people really are interested in these questions, changing their minds, beginning to think about getting active. Things are going to change in the United States, and we need you to be part of that. Thank you again very much.